This is the Rebel Author Podcast, where we talk about books, business, and occasionally bad words. Hello Rebels, and welcome to episode 110 of the Rebel Author Podcast. Today I am talking to Sebastien de Castell all about creating character voice. Now I have to say this is, well, I don't want to say I have favourites, but I thoroughly enjoyed talking to Sebastien. I love his mind, I love his characters, I loved his book, and it is a conversation that I hope you will take as much as I did from. But first to last week's question, which was, what type of launch appeals to you most? Ian Worrell said, one that would make me a millionaire or at least a high thousandaire. Also, I loved that. I loved thousandaire. I don't think I have ever heard thousandaire before. So that is a new phrase to me. But yes, I really enjoyed that. Okay, so Shane Miller on Instagram, SW Miller Author, said, Sasha Black Author, thanks to a chat with you and Wilcox Author, I realised rapid release won't work for me. Leah Copeland writes, says, already listened, I loved this one. Edwin Downward said, I soft launched my first 2 books and got the kind of response you'd expect. I'm hoping to boil the kind of advice your guest gave into something stronger when book 3 is finally ready for release into the wild. Rapid release isn't an option, and as a wide publisher, the KU factor is a non-issue. So what that'll eventually look like is still anyone's guess. So thank you to everybody who commented. Please do comment each week. I love to see what you say and see what your thoughts are on the episode. Did I mention this week's question? I'm not sure if I did. Well, this week's question is, what characters have you read with really strong voices? I know it's always bloody dangerous to ask for book recommendations, but that's what we're doing this week. So tell me, what characters have you read with really strong voices? Okay, so the book recommendation for the week this week is actually our guest's book, Way of the Argosi by Sebastien de Castell. Now, I read this and I've also got Fall of the Argosi to read, and I loved the first book so much that I went straight out and I brought Spellslinger. Now, Way of the Argosi and Fall of the Argosi are, although I think they are like books 7 and 8 or 8 and 9, they are actually prequels. And Spellslinger is book 1, and these 2 prequels are from a different character's point of view, so I'm led to believe. I haven't read Spellslinger yet, so I don't know. But they are fantastic. I absolutely loved Way of the Argosi, or Argosi, I think is actually how he pronounces it. But it is fantastic. It has such strong character voices. I loved the world building. I just loved the story, and I completely fell in love with the world building, the characters, and everything. So yeah, I really do recommend that you go and read this. I think you can read Way of the Argosi or Fall of the Argosi, although Way of the Argosi is technically the first book, as it's the furthest back in time. And then Spellslinger is the sort of main series, although it's from a different character's perspective. So yeah, I highly recommend you go and check it out. A small personal update this week, because I have only really just got back from my family trip to Holland, the Netherlands, where I visited my dad for a few days. It was lovely to catch up, and I am in the midst of trying to port across my old iMac to my new mini Mac, and it's just a bit chaos and carnage in here. And I'm also trying to finish the masterclass for Sunday's masterclass on villains, which if you're listening in real time, then it will be all over. However, I will be uploading it to my course portal. So if you did miss out and you would like to catch up on the course, then you can by visiting sashablack.thinkific.com, and you'll be able to find it there. I don't know whether it will be live when this goes live on Wednesday, but my aim will be to get it up as soon as humanly possible. And of course, there'll be a sort of takeaway sheet, there'll be transcriptions, there'll be the video, the Q&A, all of that good stuff, and the slides and everything there, audio and video formats. In terms of next week, I'm still trying to get my head around having just got back off holiday. You know what it's like when you've been away for a while and your brain isn't quite working. I am... How can I put this without giving all of the things away? I'm making lots of decisions in the background. I am thinking about setting up a secret pen name, which will remain secret. I am looking at the next books that I'm going to write next week. I should be editing mostly, and obviously working on getting up the masterclass and doing a bit of freelance, and hopefully maybe getting some fresh words for Nano as well. I won't be doing a 50,000 word Nano because I'm focusing on editing, but I will try to get some words down in November. So yeah, I think I'm just going to leave it there this week because I literally got back last night, so my arse is still firmly shoved up my head is firmly shoved up my arse. I have no idea what time it is, what's going on, or what I'm supposed to be doing other than getting this podcast done. So yes, I will come back to you next week with a better update. Rebel of the Week this week is Lena Johnson. Lena says, I used to work for this privately owned molecular laboratory that was run by crazy people. We've got a couple of stories from Lena. So one today and one for a future episode. Thank you so much for sending two, actually. I really appreciate it. Okay, so Lena says business was picking up at work and we were getting behind on our advertised turnaround time. The boss called in from out of state and said we had to work mandatory overtime until we could get that time down. What the fuck? I called bullshit because I'm the one in the lab every day and I knew more hours wouldn't change anything. Overtime pay is great, but why work extra hours just to accomplish nothing and still get yelled at by the boss? I set out to prove that working overtime would not help by calculating instrument times, how many samples a lab tech could process in a day, and concluded proudly that even with everyone working an extra 2 hours a day, the limiting factor was the number of instruments and not hours worked. I presented my case and the boss couldn't help but allow us to go back to regular hours. The best thing about this that still makes me laugh to this day is that they made me... Oh my god! I'm sorry. I forward read the last line. The best bit about this is that they made me Employee of the Month for it. Oh, Lena, you legend. That is hilarious. The irony of this Rebel story is just delicious. Thank you so much for sending this in. That has tickled me pink. If you would like to be a Rebel of the Week, please do send in your story. It can be any kind of rebellion, big, small, or something in between. And so I know I say this a lot, but we are sort of consistently at a low level of rebellions at the moment. We used to have a lot more stock and it made me much more comfortable. So I would really, really appreciate it if you do have a story and perhaps you haven't sent one in yet, if you would, because this is my favourite section. Well, other than all of the sections, but you know what I mean. I do love a cheeky rebellion. You can email your Rebel story to rebelauthorpodcast@gmail.com, or you can Instagram me at Sasha Black Author. One new patron this week. Welcome and a gigantic thank you to Genevieve Scholl. And of course, a big thank you to all of my existing patrons. If you would like to support the show and get early access to all of the episodes, as well as random bonus content, joining me for Poison and Proses, getting discounts on things like the masterclass this weekend, then you can from as little as $2 a month by visiting patreon.com/Sasha Black. Okay, this episode is sponsored by the ever amazing Pro Writing Aid. If you would like to get a Rebel 20% discount on Pro Writing Aid software, then you can by using the link to visit their special Rebel promotion page in the show notes. Today, we're going to hear from C.M. Newell. She is a young adult fantasy author and also a writing coach. You can find out more about Cassie on her author page, sassywritingcoach.com, or on her fiction page, authorcmnewell.com. So let's hear from Sassy Cassie all about why she loves Pro Writing Aid.
I'm one of those lifetime license Pro Writing Aid individuals. I love it so much. It's a part of my integrated editing for all of my manuscripts, for all of the books I have published and am working on now. The reason why I love it so much is I love Scrivener and I love the desktop plugin with regards to Scrivener. The reports are fantastic. It allows me to know where to focus on. And one of the key features that I really enjoy is setting it up with my genre in mind and comparing me to another author who writes in my genre. You don't get those kind of insights with a lot of editing tools. And this allows me to see how I'm faring against the market. I couldn't replace that. That is indispensable, and I love it. So if anyone ever asks me what I use in terms of editing, in terms of my process, it's Pro Writing Aid.
Okay, that is it for the intro. I told you it would be a shorter one this week, back to normal length next week. Thank you to Cassie for the wonderful words about Pro Writing Aid. Don't forget, if you would like your discount, you can get your 20% Rebel discount by using the link in the show notes. All right, enough waffling. Let's talk to Sebastien all about character voice. Hello and welcome to the Rebel Author podcast. Today, I am joined by Sebastien de Castell. Sebastien's acclaimed swashbuckling fantasy series, The Greatcoats, was shortlisted for both the Goodreads Choice Award for Best Fantasy and the Gemmell Morningstar Award. His YA fantasy series, Spellslinger, is published in more than a dozen languages. He spends his time writing, traveling, and going on strange adventures. Now, before we begin and I dive in, if there's something interesting about a bio, I always like to throw a random question in. So tell me about these strange adventures.
I think because I was a bit of a timid kid, in a lot of ways. Actually, I'm kind of a timid adult in a lot of ways. I found that as I grew up, I just constantly felt this need to, maybe in a sense, it's to do some of the things that you sort of, I was too nervous to do, as a kid. And so there's a lot of very strange things and it's often very small. It'll be something like I was in Mont Saint-Michel for a couple of days this summer. For those who've never been there or seen it, Mont Saint-Michel is in France. It's an old 13th or 14th century, I think 13th century monastery that's connected by a causeway. So when the tide comes in, the water's gone. And I had never seen it before. And it's this tiny place. And when you go there in the day, it is absolutely packed with tourists. There's only one sort of main street, and it's about 400 meters long, and it takes you about a half an hour to get there. It's the epitome of I wanted to go see Venice, and all I saw were tourists and taking photos in Venice kind of place. And I was staying there recently, and I managed to find a hotel room on the island itself. And I was jet lagged because I'm Canadian, so it's quite a jaunt from Canada to France. And at 3:30 in the morning, I was having trouble sleeping, and I thought, why don't I just go out and see the town in the middle of the night? And I honestly, I swear, I didn't even know if it was like legal to do so, because it's such a strange little place. And I thought, am I going to get arrested, or what's going to happen? And I finally sort of managed to do that thing that, I think sometimes as an adult, we teach ourselves to overcome our sort of fears or concerns. And I went walking out on the streets of Mont Saint-Michel in the middle of the night, and it was incredible. It was absolutely the closest experience I've ever had to time travel. Because I could walk down those streets, and even though there were still stores that had electric lights in them in a couple of places, there's lots of touristy places, but when you're just walking down the streets, all you could see was all this 14th century type, streets and architecture. And I walked all the way up to the cemeteries and up to the abbey, the monastery itself. And there's just absolutely no one except for cats, because all the cats in the island hide until the middle of the night when they come out. And so it's those kind of things that I'm always looking for, because that's kind of what informs that sense of wonder that goes into writing.
I love that. And I also love strange adventures. And my poor wife gets dragged all over the place to all of these unusual things. So for a while, I was taking a lot of tours of underground, abandoned underground stations in the UK. So all of these like derelict tube stations. And my poor wife's like, what are we doing? And I'm like, but it's so interesting. And she's like, mm-hmm. And then like cemeteries, very famous cemeteries. And I have a habit of climbing into derelict buildings that, you know, we shouldn't always climb into. But yeah, it's all the photos and like the visual stimulus that I really appreciate. So I completely understand that. I went to Dubrovnik a little while ago, and we went to the old city where they did a lot of the Game of Thrones stuff. But we sort of hung out quite late at night, waiting for most of the tourists to go. We had sort of had dinner and drinks and stuff, and it was so much better to see it where it was almost empty. I mean, it wasn't 3 o'clock in the morning, so it wasn't completely dead. But yeah, I totally understand that sense of wonder. Okay, adventures aside, would you like to tell everyone a little bit about you and sort of how you got to where you are today as a writer? What was your journey?
Sure. In some ways, my actual journey as an author is just about the most boring thing possible, because it's exactly how people used to assume it worked. You know, I in a sense, I wrote a book. I looked for an agent. I found an agent. They got me a 4-book deal, and then after that came an 8-book deal, and then another 4-book deal, and I just signed I don't know what it was, a deal for my 17th novel. And so in that sense, it's really boring. I think the part that's less boring, or the part that's more meaningful to me, is that when I was about 9 years old, my mother kind of gave me, I think, in some ways, the best gift any parent can give their kid, which was she brought me into the living room, and my father had passed away recently, and she said, you know, your father's dead now, and his pension's not really cutting it, and I need so we're going to probably need more money. So I need to find some really easy way to make money. And the simplest, obviously, is just to write a book and then sell it, and then we'll have a bunch of money, and then we'll be fine. And she said, and because, you know, and obviously the easiest thing in the world to do is write romance novels, even though they're all crap. So I'm going to write a couple of those. And my mother was a very World War II era English woman, whose notion of romance was that above all things, it should be sensible. So you can imagine what those manuscripts look like. And of course, no publisher in their right mind would buy them. And so in a sense, you would think that would sort of be proof of a kind of hubris. But hubris, it turns out, it is a very powerful tool for writers. That we kind of need a certain amount of hubris because the entire world is constantly saying everybody kind of knows how to write, but clearly not everyone should be writing novels. So why you? And for some reason, even though my mother wasn't successful at it, that kind of stuck with me. And so I didn't suffer through that as much of that sort of self-doubt. In fact, it's funny because now that I've been really fortunate in my career. My 12th novel just came out. I've been published in, I think, 15 languages. I've been making this great living doing this. I've gotten to go on book tours. And I think I have more self-doubt now than I did before I published my first book. So how I got here was that my mother had a very, very skewed notion of how the publishing business worked.
I think that is fantastic. Never have I heard that kind of a story. I think that is wonderful. And yeah, I bet your mum is super proud as well. Like, I just think that is wonderful. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of your books and some of your characters. And I wanted to talk about one character in particular who completely stole my heart. And that's Fairies. And she stole her name even. So I think that was quite wonderful as well. And what I want to focus on is voice, because Fairies has this incredibly unique voice, and you hear it the minute you start reading. So I wanted to ask you, how do you start creating your character voices?
Well, it's interesting because voice, you're absolutely right, it is such a crucial component of novels. And I think far more so today than at any time I'm aware of. When I first sold Trader's Blade, which was my first novel, I asked both my editor at Quercus in the UK, who had sort of bought world rights, and my editor at Penguin, because Penguin had bought the Canadian rights. I'd sort of asked them when on first meeting, well, why'd you bother buying this book? You know, because they both said they'd actually bought the book before they'd finished the manuscript, reading them, and I was like, why in the world would you do that? And they both said, oh, because as soon as we got the voice. And I realized that, especially for traditional publishers, and this isn't of interest to everyone necessarily, because of course self-publishing is just as good an avenue, but for traditional publishers, because they're constantly inundated with manuscripts in any given genre, what's the thing that leaps out to them right away? It's not going to be character, because you've seen every type of character on the planet. It's not going to be plot or premise, because we see all that, and because it takes a long time to get towards a character. But voice comes through almost right away. So in terms of the question, sort of how do I approach it? The funny thing is, even though I have that sense of how crucial it is, voice is probably the hardest thing to kind of turn into a particular set of pieces or terms or concepts. But typically, I think the best thing to think of is something that that always comes up for me. So Philip Pullman, who wrote the wonderful Northern Lights, his Dark Materials books, I remember him once saying something about the way that people wrote novels, and he said one of the things he struggles with in terms of how people approach their novels is, it's very unclear when you're writing a certain story who's actually telling the story, and who's it going to. And that's my thing a lot of the time and where I think voice comes through is, if you're asking yourself not just the standard POV question, who's telling this story, but the question, who are they telling the story to? And Aaron Sorkin, the great American screenwriter and television writer who wrote The West Wing and lots of things like that, he sometimes says of characters that he writes them as if they are making their case to God on why they should get into heaven. And so that is for me a bit almost sort of mind-blowing. Like, it changes how you think of telling a story, of why is that character doing this? What are they gaining from telling the story? We always tend to think of a novel as the character is just, we're in the character's head, right? But we're not really. The character is telling us stuff. They're saying, like, I ran into the room, and as soon as I saw this guy, I knew X, Y, and Z. Okay, but why is he telling us, or she telling us those things, instead of like, I ran into the room and it had the most delightful taupe wallpaper, It's the character's focusing on things, and that's because the character wants us to believe something. And in the case of Way of the Argosi, which is where we learn about Fairies as a young woman, what was interesting for me is I had this very powerful sense as I was writing it. She is absolutely trying to convince us of stuff all the time, and that's where that sort of voice is coming out, right? Even right in the very opening scene, she's describing this sort of horrible set of events, and she's describing it as if everybody else is kind of stupid, because they're all wasting their time trying to fight back, and they should know better. These are Jantep mages they're fighting. They're going to die. We're all going to die. Everything's sort of pointless. And so all the way through the novel, I kept finding I was getting this sense of her sort of telling the story to somebody very specific. And I swear to you, it wasn't until I wrote the last chapter, the epilogue of the book, that I realized who she was telling the story to. And then for me, it was this wonderful epiphany. I'm sure for readers, it's like, yeah, I guess that sort of makes sense. That's fun. But for me, it was like, oh my God, this is so perfect. I'm so happy with it. And so even though I didn't know that until I hit the end, I knew that I wanted her to be trying to kind of convince us something that isn't necessarily always true. And that was the case in the Great Coats books as well. They're narrated by a very different kind of character. Falkio Valmond is a traveling sword fighting judge. But he's always kind of trying to convince us of something too. And that's where I sort of find a character's voice.
Oh, there is so much I could unpick, and I'm almost cross that I've got all of these questions I need to ask you. Wow, where do I even start with that? I think that's very true about voice. I don't think I am, although I'm like mostly, I'm sort of edging towards hybrid now, but I'm mostly self-published. I think there are some trad books that are very voicey, but also some self-published books that are very voicey, and some trad books that aren't. But what I completely agree with is that when you find that book that is super voicey, it is like you open it and it's just like gold poured onto the page, and those are the books that never really leave me. And what I loved most about what you were saying is that we're always told to have in mind who we are telling the story to, like you said. And you pick a reader, maybe it's one of your fans, or maybe you write to your younger self, or whoever it is, but never have I ever heard it described who is that character telling the story to, or who is the narrator telling the story to. And that was like a mind blown moment for me. And it sort of reminds me of, have you ever seen the Netflix show You?
I haven't. I've heard about it, but I haven't gotten to see it yet.
So that is a masterclass in what you're saying. It's a really good example. So I will try not to spoiler, but essentially oh God, is this a spoiler? I can't really remember. Okay, I'm going to tell you anyway, just because it's so fantastic, and it literally says exactly what you're saying. The main character narrates to you being another character in the story, and that's who they are talking to the whole time, and it's just fabulous. So you either read the book or watch the TV show, because my goodness me, it is like, that is exactly what you're saying, and I think that is fantastic. So yeah, if anyone listening hasn't sort of come across You yet, then please do, because it is a really good example of this as well. Okay, so one of the things that I loved about your writing is that you employ lots of narrative tricks and tools, like your character, like Fairies being really self-aware, or like she actually almost breaks the fourth wall as well, like almost but not quite. And she uses lots of asides and tangents and things, and I think that really helps to hone her voice. So I wondered if you could sort of talk about that, how you know when to deploy those tricks, and what tricks you like, how you know which ones to choose. Yeah, just that kind of stuff, like the more prose level.
Yeah, I think it's less a case of sort of making very conscious decisions at the time of which sort of tactic or technique to employ, and more a sense of trying to broaden the range of tactics and techniques that you're comfortable with, so that you can employ them when you need to. For me, it's always coming down to pacing, in the sense that, when it comes time to employ these tactics, in the sense that I will feel like, okay, I need to not skip into this moment. So a really classic example with me, and readers can find it all the time, I do this all the time, is that when Falkio is narrating in the Great Coats books, and he's a very swashbuckling character, he will frequently go, as a sword fight's about to begin, he frequently is telling the story, assuming you don't know tons about sword fighting. And so he'll just go, now, the thing about people who use flails is they're always this, right? And so what that allows me to do is not just kind of ooze into the fight scene, but it's almost like, and it's a really easy technique to employ, that sort of breaking the fourth wall. Because what it allows you to do is it allows you to have the character tell the reader, in effect, hey, this thing that's about to happen, it's going to be really cool. It's going to be really interesting. So watch for this. It's almost, and you can do it with anything. You can do it with a romantic scene. You can imagine, you can imagine our character, Judith, or I'm just making one up. I hope it's nobody's name in particular. Judith is walking up to the house, and she says, so I with heavy heart and just, total anticipation, I walked up to the door of my house, and I knew that, my husband was home. And so I opened the door, and then she goes, now, I don't know how many of you have gotten into a really big married fight, but there are levels of how ugly it can get. And let me tell you, level 1 ugly is you say something snarky and then you smile and kind of walk away. And level 2 is where you say the thing that is going to set off their buttons, but you also know that they're probably going to shrug it off. And level 3 is where you dig up your husband's family, or something like that, right? I'm just, we're just sort of riffing on this, right? So that by the time you're then playing that scene, the reader is like, okay, which level is this fight going to be, right? And so that's what I find is it for me, a lot of those tricks and techniques, they're less tactical than, I guess, in a sense, for me, it's sort of more desperation. It's like, oh my God, how am I going to write this? It's almost like I'm terrified to write this fight scene, this argument. And so I need to give myself a little more time. And so what I kind of do is I almost assume that maybe for the reader and the character, that's true, or certainly for the character. So I let the character kind of delay the moment. You can do that without that, by the way. You can do that by having the character stand there and the reader knows that she's about to go and confront her husband about something. There's going to be this huge argument, or she's going to admit to something. And so you just have her standing outside the door of the house and just fixing the flower pots. Like she walks right up the door, puts her hand on the door, and then goes, and then I noticed the flower pots were out of order. So I kind of adjusted this and I did that. And we have all of these sort of ways. So for me, it's often about going, what's a technique that's going to allow me to control the pace of the story so that I can magnify the things I want to magnify.
Well, I think it's fucking brilliant. And I learned loads just from like deconstructing what you were doing. So yeah, thanks for doing that amazing stuff in line. Okay, now I didn't ask you how to pronounce this before we started recording, so I hope I'm going to say it right. But Fairies and Durrell's, I hope I've said that right, personalities.
Durrell, yeah.
Thank God, are both reflected in their voices. She's sort of this confused and jumpy character who reacts quite impulsively to things. And he is like mega chill, like complete hippie, super chill, philosophical. I just loved him. And yet he also has this wonderful accent as well. So how did you like create that symbiosis between their personality and then their voice, like at the sentence level?
So I think for me, when I'm writing, I tend to write in a very specific way, which is that in a sense, there's only one real character. And the real character is whoever the main character is. So in this case, Fairies is the character, and everything else that exists, the buildings, the landscape, the events, the language people use, and other characters especially, only come into being to be as annoying as humanly possible to that character. Or to create the most conflict, right? So in the case of Fairies, look at the life she's been leading up to that point. She's been hunted, she's been tormented, she's got all these enemies, she's got all this righteous outrage at the world. And so the most challenging character to meet at that point is not necessarily the character that goes, you little girl, I'll kill you, or I'll, blah, blah, blah. It's not necessarily the meanest character. It's the character that goes, the world is great. Isn't everybody wonderful? Like, I just look at this drought. It's so gorgeous. Does that kind of like, no, you can't look at the world that way. And so that's how someone like Durrell will come about. That what makes, for me, when I'm writing those characters, what makes it kind of fun is specifically the way that he speaks exactly the opposite of the way she wants and expects people to speak. And so often the way that you find sort of finding a character's voice is by just allowing that character to be the exact opposite of your character in that moment. And of course, every character, all of us as human beings, we're vastly different in every situation. But in that particular situation where they first meet, she's been alone for a long time. Things have been horrible. She sees the world as entirely oppressive and dangerous. She's just been caught, stealing from him. And then he comes in and he just starts acting like she tells a lie, and he both shows her that he knows that she's lying and then insists on playing along with her lie. And so for me, that's kind of where the voice will come out, those distinctive pieces, right? From that contrast between what the main character expects people to be like, and then allowing someone to completely surprise them.
So I feel like a complete plonker, because one of my favorite tools is juxtaposition. Like a novel essentially is a juxtaposition, because the character starts one way and ends the opposite, essentially. And I love juxtapositions at the sentence level. I love juxtapositions in description, and never have I ever thought about doing it comparing two characters' voices. Like, Damn it. So thanks for that also epiphany, which I'm going to go and stand in the corner and think about what I've done. Okay.
But let me just say, you know that in all likelihood, you do that. We all do all of these things, right? We do them naturally. One of the odd things about craft, there's that famous old saying, which I'm going to butcher here, but it's like something to the effect of talking about architecture is like dancing about love or something, or talking about love is like dancing about architecture. And who is going to book it, right? In other words, it doesn't, how could you possibly, dance about architecture? Well, how can you talk about love? And writing in some ways is the same. It's this weird juxtaposition where, I love the fact that you focus heavily in on prose, because prose is the only thing we actually do, right? We generate words, we make sentences. And I find all across the spectrum of writing lately, in the years since I've been doing this, there's a sense of no, don't worry about quote fancy prose in air quotes, don't worry about that stuff. It's about story. It's just about story and characters. And there's no character without the prose. The character literally is the prose. Prose isn't some varnish you put on the house after it's finished.
You are literally speaking to my heart. And this is the thing that I get really frustrated about, because I adore prose, and I love that you picked up on that. But it's not, I don't preach that you need to have written this flowery, purple, beautiful, whateverness. You can do so much with prose. An abstract painting is just as beautiful as a surrealist painting, and this is what we can do with prose, which is why I get so nerdy and excited about it.
And prose can be, and dead simple prose sometimes is like the essence. I was talking to a fellow yesterday who doesn't identify himself as a writer. He works in a whole other space, and I'm about to reveal the first line of what I hope will be his novel one day. But we were just talking about something else completely, and he said the thing I always tell people is coffee is a liar. And then he kind of had it, and I said, coffee is a liar is the opening to a great book, right? 4 words, dead simple. But coffee and liar, as you just rightly said about juxtaposition, right? Those are things. It's not like saying good is evil. Like coffee is not something we associate with deception. Coffee is a liar. You can go right into a million things from there. And that's when I pick up a book for the first time, that's often what I'm looking for. Page 1. Am I grabbed by the first sentence?
I am going to confess that I collect first sentences. I collect first sentences of novels, and because I'm a geek and a loser, but because so much in a first sentence. If you have a cracking first sentence, you can literally grab and pull a reader through the entire novel just because you had a banging first sentence. I love that, and I love that first line, and I really hope whoever that person is, they do write that, because that is a fantastic first line.
And what's funny is I have a book, the 4th Spellslinger book, Soulbinder. The opening line is "The desert is a liar," and I used to love that line. Yeah, but it's actually not as good as "Coffee is a liar." There's a greater juxtaposition, right? It's very easy to go when someone says the desert is a liar to go, okay, how is the liar? And you can kind of imagine ways, and that sort of softens it. When you hear coffee is a liar, you've got nothing, right? And so you're like, okay, I've got to know what the next sentence is. And that is the absolute essence of what we do, right? Our entire job is to try to make people go, what's the next sentence?
Absolutely. I completely agree. There was something else I was going to say, but I'm senile, so it's gone. Never mind. Hopefully it'll come back to me. Okay, so Doral has a really distinctive voice, as I mentioned earlier, and has a kind of an accent as well. So, and particularly obviously in the dialogue. So, I wondered what advice you could give to an author wanting to, really hone accent, because I think we can all do accent in dialogue for a short amount of time, but when you then have to expand it across an entire novel, it gets exhausting to write. So and people slip and they fall, and then all the characters end up having monomouth, sounding all the same. What advice do you have?
Sure. So you kind of raised two different pieces there, and they're both really interesting. And I'm not an expert on either of them, but I'll do my best. And the one is we sort of talk about accent, specifically in sort of how do you create a musicality to a different musicality of the way each character speaks. And the second part is how do we make sure the characters are distinct when they're speaking. And they can sound like the same thing, but they're really not. And the more you lean on the first to try to achieve the second, the more trouble you get into. The more you try to use accent as a mechanism of distinguishing which character is speaking or making a character recognizable, the more you'll get into trouble. Because, of course, there's very few things that the modern reader will sort of tolerate well. So for example, I mean, I do this all the time. I have the character, they meet a character in a small village and they're like, what do ye want, thou, ya rankin fowlers, and like that's fine when it's like the tavern master who you meet for 2 seconds and they're gone. But as you get to like chapter 14, you're like, shit, I just made that tavern master a major character in the story, and I'm stuck with his goddamn yees all the way through the book. So I will sometimes allow a stray ye into the story, and then I'll pretty much eliminate it right away. And people will virtually never notice. The only exception, and I wrestle with this all the time, is the N apostrophe instead of like IN apostrophe instead of ING, right? Talking versus talking, because talking and walking and running and them varmints, are things that people can actually endure quite comfortably. And when it's not there, we start to sort of lose it. So, but the short advice on accent for me is think rhythm instead of melody. So melody for me with accents is those very particular sort of words and vowel sounds, right? Like trying to like go ye and this and like that kind of thou and all that kind of stuff. That's all sort of for me like the melody, that's the notes. But the rhythm of speech is in many ways a more indicative in the written word, more indicative of accent. So I'm going to use a bit of a stereotypical example here, and so I apologize to everyone who's Irish. But often when we think of Irish people thinking, we put on this kind of Keebler elf sort of weird accent, where they're just like, that these kind of sounds. Yeah, right. And the vowel sounds are not where it's happening. That's not where the real sort of accent's happening. It is in the rhythms. And so I'll have friends who are from Ireland who've lived, let's say, in Canada for a very long time, and they don't quote unquote sound Irish in that sense, but their rhythms come back. And so with Durrell, I'm always looking for that rhythm. Durrell's always trying to get to the punchline. Right? Like Durrell's always, he's always like trying to get to the thing that puts the big period and everybody stops and then thinks about what he just said. And so it's that's where I'll sort of create him in terms of his voice. And now that's a very hard thing to do, or at least it's hard for me. I have to really think about it and I don't always get there. What's far easier in terms of giving characters a distinctive voice across a novel is remembering that what defines people is not so much how they say things, but actually what things they choose to say. And so certain characters, I always ask myself, what are the things that they focus on? Like Fairies will try and focus on the sort of the immediate, like we're in trouble, we need to figure out how to get past these or kill this person or something else. And Durrell will always want to talk about like how people should go through life.
Yeah, but she also loves a good aside, which I loved. Yeah. I loved that she loves a good aside, but she always cuts herself off, which I loved even more. So she tells half an aside, which is just fantastic. I loved it. I love this chat. I cannot tell you how excited I am to share this with listeners. I hope everybody else likes it as much as me. Okay, so you sort of just alluded to there a great segue for my next question, which is the philosophy behind the Argosi. Like, where did that come from? Or like, I don't want to say like what was the inspiration, but like, where are the nuggets that you're drawing from, the ingredients that help to create their culture and that sort of philosophy?
Well, I adore how skillful you've evaded the where do you get your ideas from? phrasing of a question.
It's almost like I'm a writer.
I know, it's almost like you've had 400 people ask you that question. But the funny thing is, it is a perfectly reasonable question when you think about it, because we do all get our ideas from different places. But in the case of this, so I apologize, I'm intentionally pulling us back to that question. So I've just done the thing like every writer swears they'll never do, which is which is answer without being asked, where do you get your ideas? But I sometimes think that the place that I often get my motivation to come up with a character or a type of character or an order or a plot or whatever is in the gap between what I see in the world and what I feel inside me. And so I see things in the world and I go, that's not how it works. It sure looks like that's how it works, but it doesn't feel like that's how it ought to work. So in that gap, I sort of find like the motivation for something. And so I'll give a really simple example, and then I'll get to the Argosi. So in Spellslinger, when I first read Harry Potter, which is a fantastic series of books, and I apologize to anyone who's, who for whom those books are problematic now because of J.K. Rowling's positions on things. But as books, a lot of people, me included, sort of thought these are really great, but they don't in any way reflect my experience of the world, right? Harry at sort of 10 years old thinks that he's mediocre, thinks that he's unimportant, thinks people don't love him. And then it turns out that he's actually incredibly powerful. He has a grand destiny. His parents actually loved him more than any other parents on the planet. And by the way, incidentally, he's also super rich. And my experience,
no one
ever. My experience was not that. My high school experience was standing in front of the lockers before first bell one day, watching all my fellow students walking in through the hall and thinking, wow, I am not the smartest person in this school. I'm not the strongest. I'm not the most athletic. I'm certainly not the best looking. I don't even have the nicest personality of the people. And I am completely unspecial. And so when I was writing Spellslinger, I was like, well, I don't want to write about I don't want to write about the kid who's born with the destiny. I want to write about the kid who's part of this magical society, whose parents are great mages, whose younger sister is like the most promising mage of their generation, and who he himself is like the weakest, and discovering that his powers, such as they are going away, are disappearing. I want to see what that person does. And so the Argosi came about from a very similar position, which was I think whenever I watch like Star Trek movies, like everybody loves the Jedi, right? And I love the Jedi when I watch it, and then I think about the Jedi and I hate them. and I hate them because, number one, it's all about who's born with the Force. And I don't know a lot about the Force, except that I know that I wasn't born with it. So that excludes me. And then also this thing about how it's so important that they not have all the things I associate with humanity, right? That they have to be incredibly disciplined and remove their emotions and not fall in love and all this. And I'm like, those are the only good things about being a human being. And so when I was writing the Argosi, who are this order of wandering kind of cowboy philosophers, so to speak, and gamblers living in this world that's surrounded by danger and magic, I wanted to go, no, I want them to be built around how would you, with just human abilities, fight, or survive in a world where there are mages and wizards and everything else that could kill you. And so I wanted it to be about taking all the things that make us human and going, how far can we extend those? And so the 7 Argosi talents, include things like eloquence, because I adore eloquence, right? And I have seen this happen. I have seen someone be of one mind on something and be aggressive and closed off. And I've seen someone who listens to the rhythms of their voice, speaks back to them the way they do, but with great eloquence. And then all of a sudden everything changes, right? And Durrell does this in Way of the Argosi at one point, where there's an obvious fight scene brewing, and he instead tells this impassioned kind of story, not a random story about some hero, not a story about how 4 thugs once got their asses kicked, but a story about who these guys might be. And so that's what I kind of love. And then in pure philosophical terms, so the Argosi sort of start from kind of base of humanism being built on really 2 precepts, which is all human beings have dignity and all human beings have agency. And I love that in a fantasy setting, because I think today we hate the notion that all human beings have dignity. I think we are very comfortable with the notion that there are good people and there are bad people. And that when we attribute dignity to bad people, it feels like we are giving them power that they should not have. We are giving them position that they do not deserve. But humanism calls for that, and as is pacifism. And then on top of that, there's a certain amount of classical Greek and Roman stoicism about the Argosi, right? I am only going to place emotional value on those things that I can affect. Which is also kind of like, we all experience that now, because that's like the basis of all therapy, right? Which is like, stop worrying about the things you don't control, worry about the things that you can control. And then that most integral one for me, which is like, how do you turn all human things into a superpower? Like, how do you turn music into something incredible? I don't know what it's like for you, but like, if I'm going on a run, for example, I'm a terrible runner, and I can feel like I have no energy, and then I'll listen to music and all of a sudden I have energy. And I think, just how amazing is that? How amazing is our martial arts? Humans are like the worst adapted fighters of all of the animal kingdom. Our teeth suck, or we don't have proper claws, we're clumsy. And then you see like martial artists, and you're like, look at the amazing things that they do with their body. Look at what dancers do. And so all of those things I wanted to put into the Argosi, and that's kind of how I built them out.
So many things to say. Number one, I'm a martial artist, so like I'm just laughing at you right now. Number two, that scene is one of my favorite scenes, because I loved what he did, and I loved how he outsmarted them, and I love that was how he won, for so many reasons. So yeah, I love that answer. I love this whole conversation. Right, I've got some practical questions from my patrons. So Lynn Reed Aubrey said, what tools do you like to use when you are writing and creating?
So my tools change all the time, because I'm the world's clumsiest writer, in the sense that I've had 12 books published. I've probably written another 11 other books, so maybe 23 books. That seems like that's not a lot by a lot of people's standards these days, but it's a lot for me, and I still have no idea what I'm doing. So I fumble around with all kinds of tools. Every book ends up being a challenge. The tools that I write with as of today, as we're talking, here on October 28th, 2021, I write in Ulysses, which is a Mac app that has very few of the features that one would think one wants in writing, except that it's pretty simple, which turns out to be almost the only feature that matters. The only two things I really need is something that syncs automatically across all my devices, and that's pretty simple to use. And so I use Ulysses for that. I used to use Scrivener. Scrivener's fantastic, but the sync for Scrivener between an iPad and the Mac requires that you store all your Scrivener files in one folder, and that was just like, I'm out. I need simpler than that. I've been using Plotter, Polttr, recently, as they've been developing it, because I'm a very diagrammatic person, and it allows you to kind of lay out your scenes and move things around. And I have this problem where I frequently, to understand what's going on with a book or an act, a part of a book, I need to be able to see all of it in one space, and just to see those little boxes and color them and to represent things. So those are the two main ones. But just for context, like, I own two different free write traveler devices, which are like the distraction-free things.
I did not just buy one of those in the airport today. I was like sat waiting for the aeroplane, and I just got off a plane today as well. So I'm a bit delirious. And I was like, I just don't know, like, is this going to be a gadget, or is this really going to help me like smash out more words? So please tell me, like, am I going to get more words? Or,
you know what, sometimes it's fantastic, and then other times I'm like, no, I don't need that. What I need is my big screen and my my backspace key, my working arrow keys and stuff. Because for those who aren't used to these things, the free write traveler is a couple of different devices that were made that are basically like, it's like paying a lot of money to get a computer from 1982.
Exactly what it is like. I was like, and so I don't know like how long you followed it, but I sort of followed them when they were on Indiegogo and all of this stuff, and I was like, oh, this is either like genius level Einsteinery, the best thing since, you know, sliced bread, to use a cliche, or the biggest waste of £400 I've ever spent. And so I waited and I waited and I waited and I waited. And this month I get a load of like launch income from my last book launch. And I was like, you know, I really feel like I deserve a treat. So yeah, I sat on there and I said to my wife, can I buy one? And she was like, this is just another gadget, but you spend your money on whatever you want. I was like, okay. So then off I went, like, buying it. So it arrives on Saturday, and I'm very excited for my very expensive typewriter.
You know what? I've written a few books on them. The way that it works best, I think, is if you intentionally write a book sort of into the dark, as Dean Wesley Smith likes to say, you know, without an outline, and just sit down and just type and type and type and type till you're done. I think that works really well. But yeah, I own both the original Free Write and the Free Write Traveler, which is the smaller one. Yeah. And they're both lovely. There's another device for people who don't sort of who maybe aren't feeling like they can spend the £400 on one of those devices, which is you can usually find them used, which is called the Alpha Smart Neo. I have one of those.
I looked at one of those, but it's like $50 or $100 or whatever to ship it from America, because there's like very few in the UK. And so it's really hard. I do know a couple of people in the UK who've got one, and they swear by them that they are fantastic. So yeah, I love that you're bringing this up.
Well, next time I'll probably be in the UK in March. So I'll see if I can find one for like $25 or something. I'll bring it and I'll find a way to get it to you.
Amazing.
They're lovely devices too. I actually love that keyboard. They're very old. They were designed, and I love what they were about. They were designed for kids to learn on who lived in places where you couldn't rely on power or Wi-Fi or all kinds of things to be necessarily reliable. They're super rugged. These things I think you put 2 or 3 like AAA batteries or AA batteries in them, and they last 7 months.
Yeah. Fucking iPhone doesn't even last a day. Yeah. Isn't it amazing? All of this tech, and it's fucking useless compared to things that are like 15 years old. Amazing. I love it. Oh, I'm just laughing at our whole society. Okay, another patron, Judith Mortimer, said, I know you get a lot of inspiration from music. So what are your latest favorite tracks to write to?
Oh, that's a real great question. And I have to look it up to answer it, because I'm trying to remember the guy's name. Sam. I first came across this particular song from what was it? From the TV show Alex Rider, there's a TV show of Alex Rider, which is a set of books by Anthony Horowitz, which I'd only read the first one. There was a very ill-fated movie that they tried to make. It's basically young James Bond kind of storytelling. And the title song, it's funny because like I didn't like the idea of an Alex Rider TV show, because it always looks like a posh English teenager, who turns out to be good at everything. And I'm like, who wants that, right? And he has the most punchable face. The actor's really good, but he's got a supremely punchable face. And you'll think that that's a terrible thing to say, and then you look at that photo for the TV show, and you'll be like, yes, that's absolutely correct. I don't blame him. We shouldn't blame him. It's a kind of disability to have a punchable face like that. But he's a really good actor, and actually the TV show is surprisingly compelling. But Sam Henshaw is a young, I think, British artist. Wrote a song called "The World Is Mine" that just completely kind of kicks my imagination into gear. So I love that one. I'm Afraid of Americans by David Bowie I've been listening to lately, and it just kind of really kind of grabs sort of my sense of danger and distrust. There's a version of "Let My Love Open the Door," which is a Pete Townsend 1980s song, but this is a version by a band called Luminate that really kind of grabs me as well. So music for me is like an interesting way to process emotion into thought, because it kind of will whip up a lot of different emotions in me. And because there's lyrics, just one lyric will make me think of things a lot of the time. And so, Sam Henshaw is pretty amazingly talented. The lyrics on that, it's sort of almost, but not quite kind of rap. But his lyrics are just so good. If I could write like that, I would be happy with my life.
I often look at lyrics and poetry for that exact reason, because they have this way of, I don't know, capturing 1,000 meanings in one sentence, like one lyric, one half line. Orna's going to kill me because I can't remember the name of it, but is it expressionism poetry? The sort of very short, quippy Atticus poetry, and Amanda Lovelace and is it Nikita Gill, and what's the other one who did The Sun and Her Flowers, or whatever it's called, Honey and Milk? Rupi Kaur, these sort of short one sentence like poetry. They do the same thing that songwriters do, and I love it.
God bless you for having raised the name of like the only poetry book I've looked at in the last 20 years.
I try.
My wife bought the book, and she was sitting there reading poems from it to me, and becoming quite emotional from them. And then she said, and this one, really, and then she read it, and she was almost tearing up. And I said, sweetheart, you read that poem to me 3 times in the last hour.
Yeah. Atticus, if she likes Rupi Kaur, tell her to look up Atticus. And he's on Instagram, I think, just as Atticus, but possibly on like bookstores as Atticus Poetry or something. Okay. But he writes poems about love, and they are in that same arena style wise, and I love him. I've brought all of his books, and they all say the same thing, and they're all equally emotional, and I love them all, and I'm not going to apologize for it. Okay, I can't believe this, but we've been speaking for almost an hour. I'm devastated because there's so many things that I could pick your brains about, but what can we expect from you next?
So I have Follow the Argosi, which is the follow-up to Way of the Argosi, just came out, and I absolutely adore that book. Authors probably shouldn't say that about their work, but
of course,
but I have the benefit that one of my favorite things to do is listen to the audiobook version of one of my books after it's come out, and I've been so lucky with narrators. And Kristen Atherton is so superb. Even if you've read Way of the Argosi and enjoyed it, I recommend people listen to Kristen Atherton's narration of it, because it's like listening to a whole other story, because she's an actress and she's fantastic, and she brings new layers to every line. And so for me, it's like fantastic, because I'm like, oh my God, she found something in the line that I hadn't really thought about. So that's wonderful. And then next year, Our Lady of Blades is coming out, which is the first in the new Greatcoats, swashbuckling, dueling, courts, corruption, and intrigue. Possibly the most intriguing thing will be if it comes out, because I'm struggling with the final draft of that book like you couldn't believe. And then Play of Shadows will come out the year after. And then I also have another book that's coming out that same year as well, which is the title of which is still secret.
And the lady, sorry, is it Lady of Blades?
Our Lady of Blades.
Our Lady of Blades. And is that, do they have to have read everything up to that, or is it sort of a sequel series?
It's a sequel. It's a separate series. You can have not read any of the Greatcoats and still jump right in. And not only that, the Court of Shadows, which is that's what the series is. That whole series is designed where you can actually read any of the books in sort of any order, and it all still works. So it's a bit of a puzzle piece for me as a writer. But yeah, I just love. The book came into being because I kept seeing references to churches like Our Lady of Perpetual Sorrow, and it's just like, I just love that kind of language. So I came up with this notion that in this court dueling culture, so in Tristia, the world of the Greatcoats, the trial by combat is very elaborate. And there's all these different kinds of sentencing duels where each cut on the opponent either drops a year or adds a year to a criminal sentence or things like that. And I just love this idea that duelists would take these titles like our Lord of the Dark Sword, or Our Lady of Blades, or and that Our Lady of Blades is the greatest title. So that's where that sort of came from.
Well, that sounds amazing. So I am definitely going to hit pre-order. Is the pre-order live or?
Not yet, because
Okay.
I suspect my publishers are going, we really don't want that idiot to make us lie about when the book's going to be released.
Okay. All right. Well, this is the Rebel Author Podcast. So can you tell everyone about a time you unleashed your inner rebel?
You know what? This is one of those rare times where I actually have a story that is entirely suited to the question.
Yes!
So in February of last year, and I'm glad we're allowed to swear on this podcast, because I apologize, but there's a certain amount of swearing that's required. In February of last year, I was like, I need to write a book this month. And probably a lot of writers, come into this, especially once you've written a few books and you have all these expectations about, the next book in the series, or your style as a writer, or the kinds of things you do and don't write about. And that's all on top of, and here's what people think are cool, and here's what people think is not cool, and here's what's problematic and not problematic, and all this kind of stuff. And for me, I don't know what it's like for you, but for me, I sometimes hit this point where I'm looking at starting a new book where I'm like, oh my God, like, what am I allowed to write? Like, what's appropriate to write? But not just, I don't mean in political terms. I mean, like, what will fans of fantasy agree is hip this year? And so I was spurred into a moment of rebellion against that. And I decided, like, that's it. I'm not writing a palate cleanser novel, as people sometimes go. I'm writing a fuck you novel. I'm writing a novel. I'm just going to write a book. I'm writing it in a month, and I'm going to write whatever the hell I want. And I don't give a crap about people's notions of what world building should be, or what's not cool in fantasy, or any of that shit, because I'm inundated with it constantly. And so I went and I wrote this book, and I used to love kind of like Roger Zelazny type, sort of 1970s, late 70s, early 80s kind of fantasy novels. They tended to be short. He didn't give a crap about explaining how magic worked. Like, there's none of this sort of Brandon Sanderson's like a wonderful person. I've met him before. His rules of magic, all that stuff's great. I was like, fuck you and your rules of magic, Brandon Sanderson. I'm going to have I'm going to put in rat magic, and it's going to turn out that the rat mage is like super good looking and dashing kind of figure. And I'm going to write spoon magic if I want it. And so I wrote this book, and it was just purely to allow me to tell a complete story that nobody else had to like. It was just as we might call it, an act of rebellion against not just the expectations of the world of fiction, but a rebellion against myself and the cage that I was putting myself into. And so it felt so great to just get to the end of a story that's like, this story exists only because I am writing something and I don't care what anyone else thinks. And the best part of the story is that last week I signed a publishing contract for it.
That's amazing. Oh, now I definitely can't wait to read that one as well, because that sounds amazing.
And so the lesson that I got from it, and this is the thing that I think is super helpful for people to remember, is if you keep trying to fit inside the box, what you're doing is you're walking into the most crowded space imaginable. Nobody needs you to fit inside the box. What they're looking for is not the most tepid, restrained, safe version of what you wish you could write. Because there's just a lot of people who can probably do that better than we can. I mean, look at this, like there's just a lot of authors who can do those things 14 times a month and no problem. And they're just great at it. And so I always tell people, like, if you secretly love Twilight, like if you just love those shiny, sexy vampires, but you constantly hear people telling you how Twilight's awful and how it's bad storytelling, and how it's just like gross and this and that. And you start like adopting that, and then you try to write your vampire book where you're trying explicitly not to write what you actually love. You're just going to screw it up. What you got to do is write the freaking shiniest vampires with the most sexy, the most handsome. Like, just go as far as you want with what you love, because it's only through that sort of small act of rebellion, if you will, that you're likely to find a voice that does feel like, yes, that is your voice. And you don't, the Beatles didn't need all the record companies to love their music. Thank heavens, because every single record company rejected them until they got to Decca Records. And that's the same thing for all of us as publishers, whether as writers, whether you're going traditional or self-publishing and looking for readers, it's just finding that voice. So that FU novel was kind of such a potent reminder for me.
That is fantastic. I absolutely love that rebellion, and I love that it's kind of the lesson that I learned this summer, and I'm veering in a different direction now with my own fiction for very similar reasons. And yeah, I have loved every single minute of this conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. Would you like to tell everyone where they can find out more about you and your books, and anything else that you would like to add?
Sure. I can be found at decastell.com. It's DECASTELL.com. That's by far the best place to get me. If you want to write me a letter and tell me what an idiot I am, decastell.com/contact. I promise I reply to everything. And there's, if you're a fan of the books, there are short stories available on the site built on characters and situations from the books, and that's the best way to find me. And thank you, by the way, because it's been an absolute joy getting to talk to you today.
Oh, thank you so much. And I will, of course, put a link to that in the show notes, and of course a link to the books as well. So thank you so much for your time today. And of course, thank you to all of the show's patrons. If you would like to get early access to all of the episodes, then you can do so by visiting patreon.com/Sasha Black. I'm Sasha Black. You were listening to Sebastien de Castell, and this was the Rebel Author Podcast.
Next week, we have a returning rebel, Tiffany Yates Martin. Now, we have kind of a wide-ranging conversation, and you can tell that we're friends because we sort of span across lots of different topics rather than sticking to one specific thing that we were supposed to be talking to. But essentially, our discussion is all about, creating and sustaining a long-term career, having a career across different types of publishing. Tiffany is published both self-published. She has a small press publisher and a large publisher. I believe it's Penguin that she's with as well. So she's also been in the industry for 30 years, including as an editor and a published author. So she has a vast array of experience, and we align on a lot of different topics. And it was just really fascinating to speak to somebody and to see what it takes to have a long-term career. And yeah, so join me next week as we have a wide-ranging discussion where we try to focus on writing as an editor and what that means, how to do it, and all of that good stuff. So yes, join me next week for that.
Don't forget to tune in and subscribe on your podcatcher. And when you have a moment, please leave a review.